So hello everyone, we are here in a new edition of our video blog, what we are reading of the South American Mycorrhizal Research Network. And this time we have with us Aidee Guzman. She is a postdoc, right,
Yeah.
at Berkeley. Uh, and she has this very nice recent paper in new methodologies called Crop Diversity Enriches Arbuscular Mycorrhizal Fungal Communities in an Intensive Agricultural Landscape. Um, so welcome, Aidea, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation to our video blog. So in the first place, tell us how this paper come about, under which project, this is part of your postdoc or of a collaboration, how all this paper came about.
Yeah. So I'm a recent graduate from Berkeley and then incoming postdoc at UC Irvine. But yeah, but this was part of my dissertation that I just finished. And so part of it, the way it came around, I'm going to share my screen just to sort of set the stage for the work. So the work was here in California, San Joaquin Valley, which I think a lot of people usually think this is just a place to drive by. And the work was here. And this project came to be because this landscape actually presented as a really unique opportunity to compare two drastically different agricultural management practices. Monocultures, just growing one crop at a time, versus polycultures. And that's because while the landscape mostly looks like this, just all these little squares that you're seeing in different shades of green are big giant monocultures. And the area is known for this industrialized way of farming. Inside this landscape, what you see are these really small scale diversified farms embedded within the whole landscape. And so it presented as a really unique opportunity to ask, some fundamental ecological questions about AMF, but also some important agriculture management questions. And so I worked with agriculture extension advisors to compare how AMF communities here, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal communities on these farms, the composition differed from, say, a monoculture like this. And that way we could ask two questions. One, what role do plant communities, so lots of crops, have in relationship to AMF, but also how does farm management impact AMF communities?
Excellent, thanks. So a concept that you bring about in the article, and also it has plenty of recent interest. For example, in Chile, where I work, in the recent years, there is also many people talking about agricultural intensification. So how do you define this, and how these practices of agricultural intensification can affect AMF communities?
Yeah, so first is like defining agriculture intensification. My advisors, sometimes when I write stuff there, I always put like agriculture intensification is doing this. And she's like, first you have to define what agriculture intensification is. And so in this paper, and the way I think about it a lot is these practices that are, say, like very high tillage frequency, so plowing the land, deep and long and more frequently, and then also inputting a lot of nutrients, external inputs of nutrients like fertilizers, also use of synthetic pesticides, etc., and then also reducing the amount of crops a lot. But surprisingly, there's like very little known about how agricultural management affects AMF diversity. And this is largely due because the methods have been prohibitive in terms of like looking at the composition of AMF. Though there has been a lot of studies that have looked at tillage, high nutrient inputs, and monocrops on AMF communities. But at the same time, we know very little about how the most like dramatic change of landscapes due to agricultural intensification, that being crops, impacts AMF communities. And that's sort of what we sought out to look. I think reducing crops is sort of one of the main ways agriculture has intensified the landscape.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that some of these practices are like prohibited or regulated strictly. So specifically in California, which are the alternatives, or what other
Mm.
like crop practices there are?
Yeah. So in California, you have sort of distinct regions. There's sort of like this near the coast, there's like a little bit more topography differences in the landscape. So you have farms sort of taking advantage of that. Um, and then where I worked is sort of really giant region in the Central Valley. It's mostly these giant monocultures, but some alternatives to that can be sort of diversifying the landscape has come sort of the farms I worked in with increasing crop diversity. But there's also been farmers have taken sort of advantage of practices such as like reducing tillage or crop rotations or cover cropping. So rotating crops, so introducing diversity through time or introducing cover crops through a certain period. Yeah.
So a really basic question, but so to clarify to all of us,
Yeah.
which was the main objective of this study, and what did you expect?
Yeah. So the main objective centered around two questions. So one, what is the relationship between plants and AMF communities? So this like fundamental ecological question about AMF, and then the other, what role does farm management play in AMF communities? And we expected sort of that farm management, especially those that increase crop diversity, would in turn bolster the AMF community. Though I did have some hesitations. I was thinking, you know, a lot of the farms that we worked on used to be monocultures, and then became polyculture. So I was thinking like, okay, if they've been monocultures, then perhaps, you know, the polycultures might not help because the AMF diversity is reduced. And then on the similarly, there's a lot of research that has like tried to look at whether plants or soil are driving AMF communities or whether it's stochastic. But in this case, I thought since we're, you know, uniquely controlling just for the plant host, we expected that increasing plant host diversity, especially because AMF depend on them, would increase the AMF diversity.
I see. So having saying that, I think that the can you clarify this a little bit? In the experimental design, basically you had two like big blocks,
Mhm.
monoculture and polyculture. So can you give us more details on this?
Yeah, so let me share my screen again.
Yes.
Um, so here's just to remind you again, just the amount of diversity on the polycultures. And here's some maps that we made of the polyculture. So we went out to these farms, you know, it's just growing one crop or a bunch of different crops. And one of the things that we wanted to be able to tease out is the management differences, but we wanted to control, but how do we compare monocultures and polycultures that have different crops? And so what we wanted to control for is that at least on the polycultures, we would always have 2 rows of the same crop that we would find in a monoculture. And with that, we came up with an experimental design that looked like this. And so we decided to focus on 2 focal crops. So about half of the monocultures always had squash, and then the other half usually had eggplant. And then monocultures, likewise, we always had polycultures that had squash like this or eggplant. And so then what we did is then we wanted to also take advantage of being able to compare the different crops and polycultures. So, so we set up 2 transects. One was a block like this that always ran on the focal crop. It was always on squash or eggplant on monocultures, and then always on squash on polycultures. And then we ran a transect across. So on monocultures, those were always the same crop as the focal crop, and then on polycultures it varied. And then we had 30 meters and 10 meters separations. And then that way we could compare sort of the same crop, whether it's grown in monoculture or polyculture, but also perhaps the crop host effect or just having a crop mixture on the AMF communities. And so which was also really nice because in natural systems, you can't control for this. But in agriculture systems, this like unique on-farm approach, we were able to sort of control for this and test for crop host effects and management effects simultaneously, just based on this sort of like a natural experiment or gradient on these farms.
So at the end, it is a really nice sampling design. And at the end, how many samples did you analyze, and what things did you measure on the samples?
Yeah, I should have kept sharing my screen. So then we sampled 31 farms. It was 16 polycultures and 15 monocultures. And then we sampled roots and soils. And so in total, we had about, I think it's like 372 samples, but I would say 375, but 372. And then we sampled the roots just to stain, and we weren't able to get enough roots from our soil cores to do molecular work on them. And then although it's really beneficial to set up a really unique experiment design, one of the drawbacks of working with farmers directly is that they don't want you to take out a plant because, it's money. And so then we only looked at the soil community, the AMF community in the soil directly. Yeah. And then we also measured the soil properties on the soil, everything from calcium, pH, cation exchange capacity, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, etc.
Okay, and in that point about the different soil physicochemical properties, I think that in the results at the end you had like 4 different aspects, like the transect type, that is this vertical and horizontal thing that you were just showing us. And also farm management and the soil properties index and focal crops. So can you tell us how these 4 things were estimated, and which was the most important result regarding these 4 measurements?
So yeah, we set up our model. We did like a mixed effects model, and so we always had the random effect as the farm site to account for pseudo replication and sort of the randomness across these sites. And then what we then measured the soil properties. So that was one of the variables we measured. We also wanted to account for the focal crop, whether that had an effect on AMF richness and diversity. And we also looked at farm management, monoculture versus polyculture. And then with these variables, and then we also looked at the interaction between the farm type and the block, so these transect type, so that we could see whether there was differences between the focal crops on monoculture and polyculture, or sort of these across transects in between. So we can sort of account for, was it just farm management? It didn't matter whether it was on a block, a different block or not. And then I guess one of the most important results that we find is that crop diversity does enrich AMF communities. And we find nearly twice as many different types of AMF on polycultures and monocultures. So, which is really important because these farms used to be managed as monocultures. And we don't find the effect of the focal crop, whether it's eggplant or squash, on the richness itself of AMF. And then the other result we find from just the staining of the roots, we find is that mycorrhizal root colonization is perhaps crop host dependent. And that's especially because we find different levels of colonization on the crop mixture blocks. So there's those differences. And then lastly, we find some evidence that crop diversity and soil properties could influence AMF community composition.
In a single farm, in this polyculture management, how many crops at mass you can find?
Yeah, I should have mentioned in the beginning. So these farms tend to be around 25 acres or less. One of the smallest farms around 5 acres. Yeah. And on these farms is 50 to 100 different crops are grown throughout the year. So it's just high amounts of diversity. And that's why it was like very unique. So we can like sort of take advantage of like a monoculture and then a crop diversity. And that way, like, these are 2 different extremes to be able to tease out this effect. Yeah.
And do you know or which kind of biome or ecosystem or natural ecosystem or natural vegetation type is surrounding these areas? And if maybe the biodiversity of AMF in these polycultures is as high or maybe higher than the natural
Yeah.
vegetation?
That's such a good question. So I don't know if you remember when I showed the landscape. I'll share my screen really quickly.
Mhm.
This is what it looks like. There's very little to no natural vegetation in this landscape.
Mm.
So yeah, so it was really difficult, and it was a question that I have like, so one of the questions we're able to sort of like ask is like, does it affect the management? But then I think the question I'm left with is like, not only where do they come from, and then but also like what allows for them to establish. So I would have really loved, I think in the future I'll probably compare like rangelands in the area, so it's a little slightly different management. But one of the papers I'm working on is sort of how these communities assemble in the landscape. But unfortunately, there's very little natural landscape to sort of have like that baseline potentially, or that start comparison. But yeah.
And maybe can you, I know that this was not measured in the study, but what can be like the ecosystem functions, if there could be different ecosystem functions in the polyculture versus the monoculture, or how is the flexibility of these communities to do different things in
Yeah.
the soil?
Yeah. So I wish I had a slide for that. So I think one of the things is I've talked about how we know very little how AMF management affects AMF diversity. On top of that, we know very little how then farm management affects AMF diversity, and then in turn how that affects AMF function.
Mm.
But one thing we do know is that AMF have multiple functions. Some are improved drought tolerance plants, some are salt tolerant, some are there's different seasonal, like they have different seasons, right? They're like, some are active at different types of seasons. So one might predict that if there's sort of more AMF diversity, and in this case twice as many different types of AMF on polycultures, then there's probably multiple functions. And this has been really well documented across different types of systems, that as you increase biodiversity, you increase ecosystem functions. But I think that's really important to test out in agricultural systems, especially. How much does AMF diversity translate to functions, and really test that out. And that's something that I'm really curious moving forward.
Excellent. So maybe a final word, a final conclusion that you want to state about this study, and which you consider are the next steps.
Yeah, so I think the first implication is sort of one thing I really enjoyed about the study is that we're like inching closer to this like fundamental AMF question about whether plant hosts can affect AMF community composition. And in this, like using this really unique on-farm approach, we're able to show that at least in agriculture, crop host diversity has a huge impact on AMF diversity. And I think this tells us that we really need to center plant diversity as a way to harness the multiple functions of AMF in agricultural landscapes, right? We can look at tillage and and all these other things, but we really need to think about this plant diversity sort of being reestablished in these agricultural landscapes. And then moving forward, I think I'm really curious about sort of these different questions about where the AMF are coming from, like we touched on earlier. And then also really what's going to like sort of getting at the question of like what's going to allow the AMF to establish. And I think in this case, we're showing that crop diversity is going to allow for more diverse AMF community. But more importantly, I'm really interested in all the functions that AMF could provide if AMF diversity increases, even in the face of ecological stressors. Where there's less water, does this AMF diversity help plants cope in agriculture? And there's just so many unanswered questions. And I think there's a lot of methods that are going to help us answer those questions now.
Yes, I agree that there are always many other functions besides the nutrition itself that
Yeah, exactly.
a lot of things. So thank you so much for a
Yeah.
very interesting presentation and a very nice studies. I think that will be a kind of influential study. So congratulations on that. And thank you everyone for listening, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It was really fun to chat with you.
Thanks.